thinking around how we can help our sponsors and clients get back to work. And we've done a few things like create a return to work guide that kind of really takes a look at how employees come to work in terms of their external environment, and then when they're at work, what are the things that are good ideas to jog through, and I think you'll probably hear more about those today. Given that we are one of the largest health providers for employees in the country, other things that we've also are thinking hard about is, as employees return to work, how we can help them with respect to better screening for COVID, whether it's virtual or on site, as well as mental health support services as well. So interesting times. The landscape changes very quickly, and super happy to be here and look forward to the discussion today. Back to you, Steve. Back to you, Ian.
Thank you, Andrew, and of course we're thrilled to have Manulife on board for this series. As everyone will know, things changed a lot last March, and the way we are doing things is different. And so these online series is the way we're going to be doing things moving forward. And Manulife and TD are two examples of, and the Immigration Partnership of our partners around the community that have worked with us so that we can deliver programming for our members in this new way. So thank you for your remarks and for your support, Andrew. So just before this session starts, I'd like to go over a few quick reminders. If it's not, please do ensure your microphone is muted through the presentation so we can reduce any background noise. If you have any questions that come up through the session, you can type them into the question box, which is should be on your screen in the control panel at any time. I'll try and look at those as we have time at the end of the presentation. If you are tech-related, a representative, or if you have tech-related questions, a representative of our team will get back to you in just a few minutes. If they're for today's presenter, they will be gathered throughout the session, and our speaker will do their best to answer those questions following the presentation. If we don't get to it, we'll have Stephen answer those, and we can distribute that to the group, because we may not get to everything during the session. And the final thing, all attendees will be sent a recording of today's presentation, and it will be also made available on the Greater KW Chamber website. You'll probably see it being shared via social media and through our channels as well. So at this point, I'd like to invite my good friend David Farhood. He is the Treasury Manager with TD. As I said, TD is a great partner. Kenda and David and the gang at TD are wonderful supporters and partners with us at the Chamber. So I'd like David to give him the floor so he can introduce today's speaker on behalf of TD. David.
Thanks very much, Ian. And on behalf of TD, thank you very much for allowing us to be a sponsor and to continue these events during these crazy times. So at this moment, I'd like to introduce Stephen Karpenko. He is the Senior Business Advisor for the Ministry of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade, Business Partnerships and Programs Division. With over 15 years of experience, Stephen works with small and medium-sized businesses on leaning their operations and managing through challenging financial times. Stephen provides practical advice and focuses on key challenges for businesses and what Ontario government programs are being launched. Please join me in welcoming Stephen to the Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce today.
All right. Well, thank you very much, David, Ian, and Andrew for the introduction and the good words. It's great to be here and get a chance to present to the Greater KW Chamber businesses. And recognizing there's quite a range in the KW area of businesses, including that very vibrant innovation sector. And so the impacts are kind of different depending on where you are. And I'll try and touch on as much as I can, but let's get started. There's a lot of information in the presentation, and I'm going to do my best to bring my game to you. And let's start with this picture. And I thought it really resonated with me in terms of the challenges that we're facing now, especially as small business entrepreneurs. It's one thing to be part of a larger corporation or a large organization like I am in our ministry with the Government of Ontario, but quite a different challenge when you're a small business owner and so much is on the line. And I thought that this picture really represented maybe what we're going through today in terms of those challenges and what's required. Maybe in past times, it might have been a picture of a race car on a track where, the challenges there, the competitive nature of race car driving, but at the same time, the drivers can prepare by slowing down their speed, getting used to the corners, the different elements of driving. But in today's business environment, it's probably more like these climbers crossing the crevasse on Mount Everest, where they don't really get a chance. I don't know how you practice this in real life, because the downside is pretty much it. But at the same time, it kind of represents those leadership elements that we're need to bring into the fore right now in order that we can get to our long-term goals. And so when we kind of break it down, you think of these climbers, they have a long-term goal. The big picture goal is getting to the top of the mountain, but much more critically is the short-term goal of just getting across this crevasse and then the next one and several others on their journey on a ladder that they've never stepped on before, varying widths, really needing to commit to that short-term goal and the courage of taking that first step. And we think of the courage that comes to play as a small business owner, where maybe it's going and taking on more debt in terms of a bank loan in order to keep your business going through the challenging times in order to see the other side. Probably very similar, and the focus that's required. So once you've made that commitment and have that short-term goal, just staying focused and the stamina that's required kind of on a day-to-day basis, literally getting up, facing the day's challenge, setting that intention, and hoping that the day works out as planned. And then, of course, the leadership that's required in creating that team environment of follow me, we can do this. And just as these climbers need that, and all for one and one for all, we need that in terms of our teams in our businesses, be they small, medium, or even larger, that leadership and decision making is probably the most critical skill to master at this time. And hopefully I can, if you come away with one or maybe two ideas, then we've done our job, because those one or two ideas could be the key to unlocking the major challenges facing your business and getting you to that future long-term goal. So as leaders, when we decide what to do, we must act with resolve. And this notion of visible decisiveness or leading from the front not only builds the confidence in the team of kind of meeting the challenge that is there in front of us right now, but it also motivates the team to look on their own for solutions to the kind of the day-to-day problems, so that the leader or you as a small business owner don't have to deal with everything all the time, that you're able to, not even through formal delegation, but just through the team kind of recognizing what's going on, taking a visible leadership role from you as an owner, that they can then go on and solve the day-to-day. And really, when you have that synergy happening, you have a much more capability and kind of the power of teamwork being brought to bear. So let's look at our agenda today. I'll go through the reopening toolkit, because obviously the most important thing is today and what resources you have right now to get through those challenges. But then we'll take the pulse of what's going on nationally and give everyone a feel for not just the kind of the challenge of the immediate market, but also we'll look at the global trade landscape and give you some feel for that. And then change gears a bit and start talking about strategic leadership and some decision-making tools that you can use literally today, and also as you lengthen that horizon in terms of your decision making from today to weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, and beyond, and start to maybe even rework your business model and what your business, how you add value to your customers. You may even be reworking that, and I'll go through some tools for that as well. So let's just look at the reopening toolkit. Now that we kind of understand PPE and certainly the bylaws that are out there in terms of social distancing and size of gatherings, the priority for us as business owners is to make sure that our workplaces are safe, not only for our employees and staff, but also customers. And what we've been doing at the ministry is looking at different needs on a sector and subsector basis. And if you go to the website, that the link is at the bottom of this slide, and we'll provide the slides to you, so you don't have to write that down in a hurry right now. But here I'm showing 4 different sectors, but I think there's about 10 where we've accumulated tip sheets and guidance notes that go into a fair bit of detail in terms of what you can do regarding engineering your workspace. In the food sector, it might be food safety related to COVID. In manufacturing, it's going to be where spaces might be tighter. You might have to put barriers in between people who are more closely together, face masks versus shields, etc. So a key part of that reopening toolkit is just to save you the trouble of trying to find this on your own and going to possibly unreliable sources. We've accumulated that for you. Another resource that we have are just posters that you can post around the workplace that have simple messages like cleaning tools before and after use, and reminders about social distancing. And these are things you can just go onto the website, print off. There are probably 24 different posters there or messages that you can put around the workplace. And as we know, the benefit of reminders is that those reminders over time become the good habits that everyone has. And by reinforcing that, and then as new people come on board, that becomes the kind of the cultural norm within the workplace, and just building on the safety that we know about now and adding to it through the simple messaging that we have available. In terms of PPE, I'm assuming that every business has looked into it and kind of has minimal standards met and minimum requirements. But what we're hearing is that some PPE suppliers are short shipping, and you might get half of what you ordered and get back ordered on and that kind of thing. So what I'd recommend is that you pay close attention to that, and later on I'll suggest that someone actually have that responsibility on your team. Just making sure that you treat your PPE supplies as you would any other key inventory or supply that you're ordering, and that is to just get a feel for what the patterns are in terms of your delivery, if you're getting short shipments, and certainly have more than one supplier. And so what we've done over the last couple months is created a PPE supplier directory, and we, as in our role as government, have actually been encouraging companies through our Ontario Together Fund to get involved in the creation and supply of PPE and issue purchase orders in order to create our own Ontario supply chain, and then share these different suppliers on the PPE supplier directory. So if you're looking for a second source of supply, or maybe it's not something you really feel you've stepped up to yet, here's a resource that will be really helpful and save you a ton of time. And we've vetted all of these suppliers, so we would consider them to be kind of A-list suppliers, and if they're not performing, there's certainly a channel to resolve any problems related to that. And finally, the Canadian Business Resilience Network has provided a toolkit or a checklist, just a reminder really to make sure that your health and safety plans have been reviewed, that there's compliance there with COVID-19 guidelines and those tip sheets that I mentioned earlier, that you've updated your operations plan. If there's any policies related to employee engagement, that those are reflected in writing as well, and that everyone knows, just as you would with a fire drill and fire safety on your premises, that everyone knows about where to access PPE so that it doesn't become any kind of an additional challenge. And also the social services such as daycare, supporting parents now we're facing going back to school, and that is kind of unknown territory. So anyone with a child going to school is going to be feeling that anxiety, and just as business leaders, making sure that we're displaying the accessibility to the resources and the empathy that goes with that. So that's the CBRN's reopening toolkit. And finally, video conferencing. So a lot of KW businesses in the services sector and consulting, advisory services. I'm sure many of you have already gone over this, but I certainly do get asked about different video conferencing platforms, and maybe as businesses go from sort of the first foray into that, into maybe more of a long-term commitment, doing a more thorough job of investigating and comparing platforms. So in the appendix slide, I've got more details, but this chart comes from the Gartner group, and they do different summaries of software across all kinds of subsectors. But here's the video conferencing one, and they mentioned the leaders. We have all heard of Zoom, Cisco, WebEx, Microsoft Teams. The platform we're on right now is LogMeIn by Citrix, formerly known as GoToMeeting. Adobe Connect and Google Hangouts are kind of less utilized platforms, I would say, today, but certainly viable. And BlueJeans as another one that is out there, not as well known, but has all of the features. And I would say this is the short list and ones that you would be considering for your platform. But if you're happy with Zoom and your meetings aren't long, let's say 40 minutes or less, you have less than 100 attendees, it's free. And as you build your discipline, that might be the platform of choice. Keeping in mind, however, that there are learning curves with everything, and Zoom is one that will kind of become entrenched in your workplace. And if you have to pivot away from that at some point, that there is kind of that switching cost associated with that. So maybe you're in the point right now where you need to do a little bit more research. So we've prepared some comparison for you. But I would say a $500 to $1,000 budget for the year would cover off most needs, except for really the larger, medium-sized companies and large companies where it might be more. But it's not a big budget item. Cash might be a little tight, but at the same time, think of the savings over the longer term as your team and your customers become acclimated to video conferencing and the potential savings that it represents. So that's kind of the reopening toolkit. Now let's step back and take the pulse of what's going on as we reopen nationally. So these stats are from the most recent survey from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. They've been doing a survey every 2 weeks ever since COVID-19 started, and it's been really helpful to just see what is happening. And right now we're at 98% of businesses are either fully open or partially open, and only 2% fully closed, which quite frankly is the norm in terms of just small to medium-sized business turnover in a given year. So we pretty much got everybody open, either full or partially, and 75% are making more than half or their normal sales. And this compares to 72% 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and then just 59% at the beginning of July. So you can see that the trend has kind of flattened out a little bit, and so that means 25% aren't quite there. Let's do all we can to bolster them. Maybe they're a customer of ours, or maybe they're a supplier of ours, and just certainly locally in the greater KW area, just trying to find out who is struggling and see what we can do to help. But anyway, the good news is that 75% are making more than half of normal sales. For those that are just kind of hovering around that half to 2/3, obviously it puts margin pressure on things like administrative overheads and paying the rent and those kind of things. But on the plus side, it probably means that suppliers are getting paid and you're able to build up your inventory, bring customers back in, and just use that as a base to grow from. 28% are at or above normal sales versus 26% August 5th and 23% on July 1st. So again, a flattening out of that as certain subsectors weren't hurt as badly as others. But at the same time, our goal, I think, is to get that number of 28% up to 35%, up to 55%, and then get everything to a really good year compared to last year. Granted, there was some recessionary type pressures that we were starting to identify, certainly in the manufacturing sector, and then things trickled down from there in late 2019. So comparing this time this year to last year would not include that recessionary element. So maybe we're not doing quite as bad as we think, but let's focus on the positive and get that 28% up. And 40% of businesses are at normal or better staffing levels. So the jobs are coming back slowly but surely. You businesses are able to start to rehire, and that's really, really good news. In terms of world merchandise trade, which is a good indicator of global economic health, and this is something that I've been asked about prior to these presentations, is how are we doing globally? And when you look at where those numbers 1 and 2, the blue line, that represents the last major kind of economic collapse we had in 2008. And you can see that the line kind of returned back to its prior level after about 2.5 years. And if you shift to the right and look at the green line around that number 3, you can see that the dip and recovery follow a similar pattern to what we saw between 2008, 2010. And so that's the best case scenario. And if that happened, then I would say that we're on the road to recovery. Certainly, manufacturers purchasing indices from manufacturers are showing recovery and showing growth. So that's all good news. There's still a lot of unknowns up ahead, and that red curve kind of represents the worst case scenario, which would be a longer term malaise, if you will, or between that, say, 20 and 30% decline. We're seeing the recovery, which is great, but like I said, we don't know what the future has. Let's keep our fingers crossed and keep working hard. In terms of global trade trends, as would be expected, North America and Asia would be hit the hardest, with 2 of the world's largest economies, the US and China. And there certainly were double-digit declines at the beginning of the COVID period, and remains to be seen what we'll see towards the end of 2020. But the sectors with more complex supply chains, tighter pull inventory type of systems where inventories are managed very carefully, there's a lot of innovation and kind of change that goes on with parts and multiple parts, electronics and automotive products. They're going to see more challenging times. But again, as I mentioned before, we're starting to see recovery in these sectors as new ways of doing business and new the supply chains are reinvigorated as growth returns. Of course, tourism and hotels, as we all know, are still under the gun, if you will, and it's hard to say when the borders will reopen and when we'll return to normal in those sectors. And hopefully businesses can pivot into something that closely resembles their old business. Maybe it's more localized tourism. We certainly have seen a lot of that in Ontario, and other forms of providing that type of service without the cross-border traffic that we saw in the past. And obviously sales organizations are having to learn how to do business without the in-person meetings, the attendance at trade shows that we used to have. And our ministry does a lot of trade show stuff. If you would have been part of any of our trade missions, and we're starting to do those virtually now and really ramping that up, as is the Board of Trade. There are still challenges facing Ontario businesses. These were there before in the sense that we had challenges with international trade and the trade war, if you will, that was going on between the US and China, and Canada's we've had our own challenges. Speed of innovation, keeping up with that in those who are in the innovation sector, and just the amount of effort and resources that go into pivoting around business models and just trying to get that product shipped on time. The credit markets, as much as interest rates are as low as they've ever been, the act of getting a loan and getting approved, there's more scrutiny and certainly different levels of compliance that are required. And so for some, borrowing will be a little bit more difficult. And the investments in technology are still there. So the larger companies, whether it's through consolidation or picking up competitors along the way, that they're able to adopt new technologies that really enhance their real-time decision-making and ability to meet customer needs. So all of these things are going to be here going forward, and as we recover and the focus shifts back to that competitive nature of our business markets, that these things that were there towards the end of 19 and things like getting new access to talent, certainly in the KW area where we have a lot of innovation, and people who are working for companies overseas and in the US. I mean, all these things are still there going forward. So now let's shift to some strategic leadership concepts. And the first thing is leading today's business through reopening. And when I say today, I mean without shifting business model, working with what you have and the team that you have today. What can you do? And one of the things is just refocusing the company and your team on the great work they're doing and just reinforcing that and giving everyone a pat on the back and giving yourself a pat on the back. That's something that's right there, and you can almost like you can't do enough of that, and just looking for the little successes and taking time out to celebrate those, and including customers in that and collaborating with them and welcoming loyal customers back and doing your best to just acknowledge how important it is and how much meaningful it is to have those customers come back through your store and greeting them and asking them to maybe for a referral or some way that if there's anything else that you can do for them, that you're able to do that. And so that's collaboration with customers, letting your brand speak. If you've been fairly quiet on social media or on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, whatever your platform of choice is, that you get back out there and start to maybe share some of your story and what it's been like for the last 4 to 6 months with your business, and letting your brand kind of shine through as being there for your customers. And what will happen as a result is that that bond of trust, which is so key to any sales activity, will start to reemerge, and you can reimagine it even and see where it goes, because everyone's gone through the challenges and has stories, whether they're suppliers, customers, or competitors, and just building those bonds and seeing where it goes from there. And then communicating nonstop, whether it's through social media, in person. Just make sure that everyone is kind of a greeter as they come into your shop or when you answer the phone call or providing customer service, that people leave feeling better than when they came to that conversation. The second thing I'd like to introduce is something that's been around for a while, and this is the Stephen Covey from the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, a great book written around 1995, so some time ago. But here's a takeaway that's always been with me, which is the ability to separate the activities that are important from those that are less important, and then those that are urgent from not urgent. And if you can kind of in your mind or develop a habit around that and the assessing your own activity as a business leader, that you'll just find time to make space for those things where you have to step back from kind of the critical day-to-day and make more time or recreate that time that you used to have in terms of planning and strategizing. Because like I said, those challenges are there. So it's not just the things that we've been experiencing the last 4 to 6 months, but there are the bigger strategic issues. And if you're in global markets and global trade, you know that there's still a lot of opportunity out there. We have all the free trade agreements in place that we have, whether it's CETA with Europe or the new trade agreement with the United States, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's lots going on globally, but you really need to set that time aside. And so my advice is to really identify what the most important things that you have to do from day to day. Certainly deal with the ones that are urgent and most important, but also make it a habit and make it a priority to set aside time for what we see here as quadrant 2 activity, which is it's important, but it's less urgent. Strategy, it's not going to change what happens today, but it certainly can make a big difference 3 to 6 months from now. And that goes for things like team building activities. Maybe back in the old days, we had the luxury of a golf outing or some sort of team building that just seems to have gone away because of what we've been going through. That what's the new equivalent of that? And maybe having shorter duration events, but more of them in order that you can celebrate together, even if it's virtual over a Zoom call, that just having those chats and sharing, not necessarily formal business challenges, maybe very informal and just chatting to renew acquaintances, but certainly making time for that quadrant 2 activity. And then things that aren't urgent and aren't important, I just think that right now there's a letting go that has to happen, and that we don't feel attached to those things, that we let them go and move on and stay focused on the challenge at hand, coming back to those climbers on Everest in the very first slide. So new business models and the opportunities that come about as a result of change. So crisis is an impetus for change, and then with change comes opportunity. And when you look at this list, when you see number 1 and 2 facing the challenge, taking control of cash, everyone stepped up to that already, I'm sure. And then number 4, that's that leading from the front and being first to volunteer or to sacrifice on behalf of the team. I'm pretty sure that's gone on as well. So let's just talk about number 3 and 5. And the first one, I've already touched on it, is just if you can create that space to feel like you've got a little breathing room, and maybe delegating, or now that you've kind of got the team back together and humming, that you can take the world off your shoulders and share that burden with others, so that you can start to feel a little bit of the freedom and get back to those quadrant 2 activities. And then the second thing is that once you do that and start to have some clarity and renewed focus around the challenge, that you can be aggressive in the marketplace. That if you see an opportunity out there, you see it's a risk that's manageable and worth taking, and you have the resources to deploy to do it, be aggressive. It's probably a great time to get out there and to, if you're into doing something global, to start participating in these virtual trade events, whether it's with the Board of Trade, the Chamber of Commerce, with our ministry, and start to knock on some doors, maybe some customers that you haven't had a chance to talk to, making that a priority, and then being aggressive and being confident out there as you go after new business. Reopening models, I think we can put a check mark next to that. We probably all got the social distancing markers and the PPE in place. Going back to making sure that you can keep that going. We don't know about second wave and all of that, but I think reopening models, we can put a check mark next to that. Now it's time to start thinking about new business models. And in this, I've got sort of self-serve grocery stores, or it's the airlines maybe reconfiguring their seats. We haven't seen either of those things in the workplace yet, or in the marketplace, but I think we will. And you just know that certainly in KW, as innovation minded, that you're already working on stuff that is going to be coming out, and it's going to be responsive to our current challenges. And like we were saying, we had a little chat before we came on this morning. Who's going to need that business tower going forward? And what are the other innovations besides video conferencing that are going to support work at home models and changing workplace behaviors? And it could be with education. So there could be all sorts of stuff to come. But now's the time to start thinking of that. And in the bottom right, you see something that's a little bit closer at hand, which is this technology adoption focus, factory of the future. It might be smart cities, industrial Internet of Things, that there's all kinds of stuff that we now can start pushing forward, knowing that it addresses the challenges of the day. And here's a good example. I got a question of, what do we do with our patios? I mean, it was great that the governments and policymakers responded in terms of shifting roadways and stuff to create more space for patios, so that we could welcome customers back when we couldn't have everyone inside. But what's going to happen in the winter season? And when you get the slides, just visit some of these links, or maybe Google yourself patios in the winter season. And these are all from like 2017. But there were stories where being outdoors during the winter was actually trendy, and people who were running restaurants and patios outside in Edmonton throughout the winter. It doesn't get any colder than Edmonton. That there are different examples, and you might actually get some ideas. So have confidence that as we shift into the winter season, we'll adapt, businesses will adapt, customers will adapt. Looking at your business model in terms of finding out what's working now and how do I make these shifts, we call them pivots, we call them business shifts, that this business model canvas from a Canadian company called Strategizer is a really popular and useful tool. And I'll just go through with you now. The key areas, first is your value proposition. What is it that customers are paying for? What is it that you do that's different from your competition, that or your suppliers, that allows you to command your price in the marketplace? That's the first and main thing. The second are those strategic resources, whether it's key partnerships or your factory assets, if that's what it is, or your office environment that you used to have that you've now shifted to virtual. The key customers that define your business, what are they? And that translates into more specific customer relationships and channels, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's bricks and mortar retail, whether it's global trade now through video conferencing, that your channels are part of your business model, and that translates into the revenue streams. And then shifting to the bottom left, the cost structure that you require in order to deliver that value and to generate that revenue. And then of course the key activities or action plan that supports that. And the first step with right now is not to say, oh, I have to throw everything out and start from scratch, or this represents a new business planning exercise, which I don't have time for. Nothing of the sort. What I'd suggest is the business model canvas is a great brainstorming tool for you to look at these key areas and bring focus to your discussion. And the first thing is to say, well, what's working and what isn't really something that we want to change at this point that we think we're right. It's just a matter of tweaking a few things and getting back to business and to what we do best. And those are the check marks that I've highlighted here. For different businesses, it might be different areas, but I think the point is to check mark or to identify that what's working and to say this is where we are. Now let's look at the other parts that maybe aren't. And one of the things that we've seen in many sectors, of course, is channel disruption. And that could be, if you look at what happened to Airbnb as a great example in the tech space, where their world has been literally turned upside down, and that's now affecting condo vacancy rates, certainly in the city of Toronto, and that the vacancies in condos are affecting the apartment rentals, and apartment and rental rates as a result are going down across the board. That's huge channel disruption, and so you really got to get at that. Another example might be if you're a restaurant where you had a fairly substantial and maybe advanced kitchen, you probably had a catering sideline, which has now been disrupted by the fact that everyone's working from home and we don't have those office events to cater anymore. So identifying what channel disruptions, you may have new competition from big players like Amazon, e-commerce related. All of these things are what I would call channel disruptions. So you got to take a look at that and see where you are and what you can do differently in terms of maybe going to e-commerce yourself or finding other ways that you can utilize key assets. Because obviously that affects your value proposition. So with a change in channels and disruption comes a requirement to change your value proposition and look at your processes and look at what you're doing and look at your customer base and saying, how else can I help my customers, and are there any new customers I can get that are out there? And then, of course, the impact on your revenue streams. In the short term, your pricing may be affected by the fact that you need to offer discounted pricing to get new customers in the door. But in terms of your value proposition, you don't want that to be a long-term thing because, as we all know, competing strictly on price is a very, very difficult game and certainly not for everyone. So if you're doing things like your revenue streams, trying to bolster them by lower price, more volume, you need to get back in your value proposition to a higher price and maybe keeping that same volume of customers, which would be a really positive shift. And then, of course, how does that impact your costs? Question mark there. It's going to be different for every business, but looking at your cost structure, where can you save? Maybe you can renegotiate your lease, renegotiate with suppliers, payment terms, speaking with your bankers, different lenders, getting short-term loans, taking care of government supports. All of these things are things that affect kind of your cost and cash position. And then building an action plan around that where everyone is involved and you're all pulling together. So this is kind of like almost like the one-page business plan, but imagine the power of it if you go through a process like I just described. And of course, you have your pre-COVID view, your current, because as we go through reopening, you need to have a kind of a view for where you've come from. How do we start to rebuild that through opening? And then as we shift and pivot around a new value proposition, what does our future start to look like? And then setting timeframes or short-term goals that might be monthly or quarterly, but eventually getting to the point where you're thinking more strategically, you're using more time in those quadrant 2 activities, and you're getting into the 6-month, 1-year, 2-year time frame. And just to shed a little bit more light on this term value that we use a lot. Here's a chart from and a tool that we use in lean operations called a SIPOC, Supplier Input Process Output Customer. But what I want you to focus on is where your value is added, and it's in the processes, that the things that you do and the outputs that you produce at the price that you produce them. This is your notion of adding value. And if the processes and outputs that you're creating are easily replicated, i.e. you're in low barriers to entry, then of course you're exposed in terms of competitors coming in and taking away some of your orders, your customer base, your revenue. So when you look at that value proposition, it's really looking at what you do and what you produce at what price, and that's where your focus needs to be. And if you're not doing anything different from anyone else, then you need to be able to step up to the competitive exposure that you'll have. And because if you're not doing that, then your suppliers and your competitors, they'll start to deal directly with your customers. And obviously that's not something that anyone wants to have happen. In terms of decision making and evaluating ideas, here's something for you. It's a test card. It's from Testing Business Ideas by David Bland, which is one of the Strategizer divisions. And what it proposes is not some kind of formality or a thing that you need to have everything suddenly in writing, but just maybe a cultural adaptation in terms of how you do stuff in your office, in your shop, where every idea or decision that you have everyone thinking about what the expectation is, i.e. we believe that X will happen, our hypothesis. But to verify that, we want to make sure that we at least test something and have some verification, and that we can measure our results, and that we know if we're going down the right road or not. And therefore, what this implies, this process, is that your decision-making timeframes are fairly tight, because you don't want to spend a whole lot of time on accumulating measurements and tracking, and then it's 4 months before you can actually implement something. Instead, what I propose is that you use this as a tool, and that you're kind of testing multiple things at once. And in web advertising, social media, we call it A/B testing, where you run multiple ads, see which one works, go with that one, run multiple ads, and it's almost like you're competing to see which is the best and most effective advertising. That you talk to your customers, that you get feedback on social media, that you use your data analytics that are available to you on your website, whatever, that your testing methods are fairly short term, that you're looking incrementally, you're seeking input, and you're agile around this. But the fact that you're a little bit more formal and a little bit more aware in terms of the evaluation of ideas before you make a decision, and that you empower everyone on your team to do that, I think will result in better quality decision making and increased confidence in the team that you're making the right decisions and allowing yourselves to set your sights moving forward. And I mentioned earlier on about this. I know it's a lot of information. Take a breath and let's just for a moment. But I mentioned earlier on this concept of a network of teams, and I'm going to give you 4 key pieces of information that I believe every company, every business needs in order to move forward. And the first thing is just the workforce and customer protection. And that was the first thing I went over in the presentation, was the checklist of things that you can be doing today in terms of PPE and all of the other elements, but making sure you have someone on your team who's got responsibility for that you as an owner, as a leader, can turn to somebody with a phone call, with a quick chat, with a Skype conversation, and just say, hey, what's the status of our PPE, and get that information right away. And similarly is supply chain stabilization. So where are your orders at? Is somebody tracking the success of some suppliers versus others in terms of meeting your order commitments? Because obviously in-stock position and where you're at in terms of your inventory is critical to being able to serve customers. So making sure you have that piece of information at your fingertips. And of course, customer engagement. Are your customers happy? Is there a way that You can adapt your e-commerce site that when an order happens, maybe have one of those 2 or 3 question surveys. We're seeing a lot of that. When it comes to engagement on the telephone, same thing, more and more of that. And I think customers, if your questions are brief and to the point, are more than willing to provide you with feedback. And then, of course, it's on you to respond to that. So having the finger on the pulse of customer engagement, to me, is the third critical piece of information. And the fourth is just financial stress testing and knowing where you're at in terms of your ability to pay the bills both today, next week, next month. What are your trends? Are you getting paid on time from an accounts receivable standpoint, making sure that your receivables don't stretch out too far? So these are the 4 key pieces of information, and to make sure that somebody has that responsibility on your team. So that may be a little bit out of the norm for how you're organized right now, how your org chart looks, but just making sure that you have those responsibilities assigned. Because the decisions we're making within uncertainty, we're in a cycle of more of them and more critical nature, i.e. they need to be decided on more quickly. In other words, we're spending more time in that quadrant 1 of important and urgent. But it really, we need to create those behaviors and mindsets, whether it's the messaging around the office related to workplace safety, whether it's having the key pieces of information and people knowing that they're responsible for that. Because what it allows you to do is to start looking ahead and taking that weight off your shoulders, as I mentioned earlier, and give yourself a pat on the back. It gives opportunities to report people on your team for a job well done. And that so within this cycle of importance and urgency, multiple decisions, that with these tools, you're able to step back and have a little bit of space to assess and anticipate, and then you can act with confidence and move forward and not second guess decisions, but know that by moving forward, by having those measurements, by having that those comparisons in place when you make a decision, that you always have the confidence you're going down the right road. And so that implies a decision-making framework of having everyone in the mindset of not just knowing what the benefit of doing something is, but also what the costs are, and also the risks, and having a notion of being able to mitigate risk. And if you have that with your team, then you'll always be making good comparisons of options, and it becomes, again, a fairly great habit to reinforce. And the final tool I'll give you is just this, what we call a RACI model, where as you make decisions, that everyone knows who is doing the work, who is responsible, i.e. who the supervisor or team lead is on it, who needs to be consulted, and then who needs to be informed after a decision is made. And if you do this around all of your key activities with your key personnel, your ability to communicate as a remote, dispersed team will be much greater. Your confidence in your decisions will be much greater. And so as you start to adopt and integrate these different tools, again, not in terms of creating bureaucracy or more work, but creating clarity and a more streamlined decision-making processes, that you'll be a lot better off as we go through reopening and into growth. So demonstrating that calm, bounded optimism, and of course with empathy, as I mentioned earlier, recognizing that everyone's going through challenges, and just being great listeners and coaches as leaders, that again, it just builds a much more solid team foundation. So finally, just in terms of summary, we've talked a lot about navigating uncertainties and mitigating challenges. The types of decisions as we build our better future, the first are going to be around people, and we talked about the communication, the PPE, the care, the support, the empathy, the coaching, decisions around that. The second will be designing and redesigning workspaces that work. So not only just the short term, what we're doing now, but also and creating security, but also rethinking how our workplace will be in the future, and what impact that'll have on your cost model. It may become a great source of cash as you can get out from underneath leases that might free up a lot of cash flow. But then solving in phases, as I mentioned, solving incrementally, not waiting too long, that you're testing, you're strategizing, that a lot of the decisions come out of this quadrant 2, being able to step back away from the urgency of everything and put a longer term view on things, setting priorities, and then using the leadership that we've been going through all through the presentation. And then, of course, the elasticity of your cost model, knowing that as your business model pivots, your value proposition changes, as you get away from disruptive forces, that requires some elasticity in terms of costs. And certainly there are sources of new loans out there if that's what's required, maybe through analysis freeing up some cash flow related to your accounts receivable, your lease terms, etc. But that's going to have to be a little bit fluid and adaptable. And then just getting future ready by listening, scaling, and being agile. And we're going to get through schools reopening. We're going to get through if there's a second wave. Hopefully it's limited and manageable, and that we're going to reopen business and global trade as we envision it, and that everything is great and we can build that better future. So thank you, everyone. That's a lot of information, but like the slides will be made available and the recording, and hopefully you've got that one or two ideas to move you forward. So thank you very much. I don't know if there's any questions out there.
Thanks, Stephen. And that was a lot of information, but a lot of great stuff in there. We've got a few minutes left, so just a reminder, if you want to go into the chat box and put a question in, I'll look for those in just a minute. But right now, I'd like to invite Andrew Kugler from from Manulife to come back and thank Stephen and maybe kick off our question and answer period. Andrew?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Ian, and thanks a lot, Stephen. It's a great presentation. Very timely and relevant to what I do. The one question I had for you, and it probably just goes back to the comment around office towers, and curious, as you've unpacked data and surveys, and you are going to potentially, I don't know if you have a pulse on how many businesses are potentially going to have vacant space in the future, and maybe benefit or ramifications of that wave. It feels like it could be a bit of a material thing as we go into the fall and the spring. I don't know if you can elaborate a bit more on what you're seeing there.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Actually, there's so many implications around space and workplaces. There are legal ramifications from in terms of workplace health and safety guidelines and all that stuff. But besides that, we had a webinar from somebody who is specializing in workplace redesign, and they took a sample workspace that was originally designed for 70 people, and they reconfigured it and re-engineered it around what we're now kind of coming to feel as the new guidelines, and that space for 70 was now adequate for 15. And so it's interesting when you kind of put that together with the how many days per week would everybody want to go back to work. And I know in our workplace every day we're doing daily attendance, and I don't think it's to make sure that people are at their computer so much as just kind of generating some numbers in terms of who's working from home, who's going into the office, and who has to be in the office. And when you couple that, who wants to be there, with the fact that maybe only 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 would actually physically be able to be there, that it might be that the space needs don't change that much. That's a possibility. But then you're getting a lot less bang for buck out of kind of a per person usage of that space. And I got to figure that points towards companies saying, wow, we can't afford that. And it puts a real pressure on the landlords. And I think that's where we're at. We have a lot more questions than we have answers, but certainly the data is being collected. But when you kind of look at the different kind of pull and push forces that are at work, you got to wonder whether there will be any need for that when you think of it financially.
No, that's great. Thanks for that.
I just want to build on that a little bit. There was one of our attendees asked a question around, in this systemic change, it's a health crisis, but it's also there's an element of this which is there's a lot of things that need to systemically change. Climate being the one that she raised, and I think if you put all these things together and say there has been already in this period of time a systemic change because of the health crisis, some of that's being, you know, the climate issue of the importance of transit, but safe moving people back and forth, that will still happen. Working remotely, you just touched on, and what's that going to look like? What's the percentage of people in an office environment versus working at home? And then layering in, a lot of employees may want to stay at home. So can you get them back and be motivated to come back? So when you think about, we've got lots of problems to solve out of this, and this is really identified healthcare problems, climate, and space, and the health piece of it. But then also, how do you move people back and forth safely? We can't. I don't think we'll ever go back to the same type of commute and the same types of numbers which you just described. I don't know if you can weave those together, because I think there's what we've, I think, traditionally done has been more siloed and linear versus saying this is there's a whole bunch of stuff that this has brought to light.
Yeah, those are great comments. Like maybe on the transit side, the transit services will learn to adapt in terms of their scheduling and maybe reconfiguring their own space within a bus or a subway. But as we know, carpooling, it's kind of been shoved to the side a little bit because we haven't had the need, but I know there's been a lot of innovation around carpooling, and that could certainly come back in terms of like everyone having their personal bubble of say 3 or 4 people. The wild card in all of this, of course, is vaccines and how culturally we'll adapt to vaccines, and how that impacts policy and guidelines and all that. And I think that to me is the big wild card. And for the big property owners who are holding on to multi-story office towers and stuff, it's a little bit like holding on to stocks when their price is down. It's like, do I hold on to it, or are things going to improve, and how long do I hold? Because it's certainly a possibility that those assets will come back into play, maybe in a way that we can't really see right now. But it's kind of a little bit early to be counting anything out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are all important questions, but I think, you know, as you've described, there's a lot of pieces that need to be factored into what this new model is. Listen, last question, because we're almost out of time. Appreciate your time, but one of the things that is struck e-commerce and you touched on some of this. Are there supports in particular? I know there's supports for startup businesses, for women entrepreneurs. You know, things like Digital Main Street that has come out with Shopify and Toronto Board of Trade, which has been distributed across the province. We have our Shop KW, which is how to do online e-commerce local, which is available to our members. Maybe talk just a little bit about those things. I think that's probably in the short term, just about every business has to figure out how they can do things on an e-platform, which is one of those initial steps. There's things to do, but what are some of those supports, and what do you recommend for people to get started?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, to me, e-commerce has kind of shifted back in the pre-COVID days. If you were setting up an online site, it was to get customers who maybe were in completely different physical markets. Like, let's say you're a bricks and mortar retailer and you wanted to open a website just to get more, ship more product basically, and that you use social media channels to create awareness and drive people to your site, etc. That now it's almost like e-commerce is also a clicks and mortar local solution, where your loyal customers, as much as they may want to come back to the store, maybe they're not comfortable, or suddenly it's inconvenient because transit's not as accessible, or whatever it happens to be. That to me, it's almost become a necessity that every business at least look at it. And it comes back to that business model canvas. It comes back to thinking incrementally and doing some split testing in terms of this way versus that, and the agility and everything. But I would say really take advantage of that Digital Main Street program, because part of it is Shopify, which is a great platform. I mean, there are others out there, but it's just so turnkey that they've changed their free trial as a result of the program to 90 days. So you can try it for 3 months without having to pay anything. Then there's the subsidy that comes with Digital Main Street. So assuming that a business has the time, and I would hope that trying to find a time, coming back to that quadrant 2 type stuff, that you take a shot at what you're at least sketching out what your online presence might look like, and not necessarily to get new customers, but to just serve your existing customer base. Because our stats, like coming into like pre-COVID, were that 60% of businesses now, a chunk of those maybe don't require it because of their sole proprietors or whatever, but 60% of businesses didn't even have a website, let alone an e-commerce presence. So there's lots of room to grow into that, and that's probably a permanent part of our shifted landscape as well.
Listen, thanks so much, Stephen. That brings us to the end of today's session. Thank you once again to our title sponsor of the Business Success Series, Manulife, our platinum sponsor for the Business Success Series, the Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region, and this month's presenting sponsor of the Business Success Series, TD. And obviously to today's speaker, to Stephen Karpenko, is Senior Business Advisor at the Ministry of Economic Development. I have to read this because there's so many parts to it. Ministry of Economic Development, Job Creation, Trade, Business Partnerships, and Programs Division. So I don't know how you fit it all into one day, but thank you, Stephen. That was a great presentation. And to our listeners, we'll be making the presentation available. This will also be the broadcast will be posted on our website as well. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining us today. As a reminder, we host a new Business Success Series session every Wednesday at 11:30. Next week, we'll be hearing from the Canadian Mental Health Association of Waterloo Wellington. Helen Fishburne will be speaking. Hope to see you then. For all details on this and other programs, go to our website at greaterkwchamber.com. Please do share the fact that this series is starting, and it will be weekly, with your friends and colleagues. I think there's lots of great content that are important for, in particular, small and medium-sized business, but any business owner. And do join us every Wednesday morning for the next edition of the Greater KW Chambers Business Success Series, brought to you by title sponsor Manulife, our platinum sponsor Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region, and September's presenting sponsor TD Bank. Because if it's Wednesday, it's the Business Success Series. Thanks so much and have a great afternoon.